Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining Acacia Counseling and Wellness in our Wellness and Love webinar series. The webinar came together when we at Acacia wanted to find a new way to engage the community during these unprecedented times. Mental health will always be a priority to us, and this is one way we could continue providing resources, engagement, and opportunities to share wellness and love. Join us in the push for self-care and the enlightenment of mental health every week in June on YouTube Live. Today's guest is Maddie, and they will be providing us with Therapist's Toolbox for Quarantine. This session will be open for your questions and comments, so please use the chat feature on this webinar. We encourage your feedback and engagement as it helps stimulate conversation. Also, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel following the session. So if you subscribe, you can watch this video and more and participate in the last webinar we have next Tuesday. Before we get started, we also wanted to introduce a few resources that we have found to be pretty valuable. Acacia is part of the Minnesota community, and we also know what's happening there is not just affecting their city, but cities all over the world. If you're looking for ways to continue to help and support as the push isn't over, you can start here, but we encourage you also do some research on your end, whether it's for Minneapolis or the community that you are a part of. As a counseling company, we know that it will take everyone's effort to help heal from trauma, process the deep-rooted racism, discrimination, and murder of our Black and Brown communities, and to demand justice. We thank everyone who has contributed and are having dialogues, including our providers who are helping clients during this time. Lastly, if you're feeling that things are too much, please use the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741-741. Thank you again for joining us today. We ask that you engage and participate as much as you can, and I'm so happy to introduce Maddie.
Okay, well, hello, everyone. So I have to say hello, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I am so glad to see you all and be live here with you on the Acacia YouTube channel. So like Corby said when he introduced me, I am a therapist. My name is Maddie. I'm a therapist at Acacia in Minneapolis. And I am also the host of a podcast, the official Acacia podcast, which is called Sincerely Not Okay. And we actually have an episode that we recorded about COVID anxiety really early on in all this quarantine stuff. So go check it out. There's some really good guests that we talk about some really fun stuff. Sincerely Not Okay, the podcast. Anyway, so the thing that I want to talk about today is my sort of therapist toolbox for quarantine. And when I was like thinking about what to talk about for that, I was kind of thinking, well, we're kind of in the quarantine. Like we've been in some version of isolation or quarantine for like a few months now. So I feel like we're kind of getting used to, like we're getting in the groove of it. People are kind of figuring out the contours of like what isolation and quarantine looks like for us. And so I think first of all, I'm just curious, like for you guys listening or watching, what has quarantine looked like for you? Like, have you started to find a routine, or are you still really struggling? So yeah, so anyway, but I thought we're deep into quarantine. People are finding their rhythm. There's a lot that's been like written about quarantine, a lot about like a lot of people who have shared really awesome resources. And I was wondering, like, okay, where does this like therapist toolbox that I have kind of fit into this? And so what I want to kind of share today is like a pretty not simple, but a little bit more of a like a narrow focus on a few different skills. And I kind of group them into skills for grounding, skills for connecting, and skills for being nice to yourself, which is the being nice to yourself part is where we're going to just talk a whole lot about self-care. And it's going to be amazing because I adore hearing people's like ideas around self-care, especially like the really creative types of self-care that can happen in quarantine. So I think that, so first of all, get ready, get your thinking caps on to tell me what self-care stuff you've been doing. But yeah, so I want to talk about grounding, connecting, and being nice to yourself. Yeah. So we'll start with kind of like the grounding category. So what is grounding exactly? Well, I think about grounding as when we're stressed or like really flooded with emotions, whether that's like the anxiety around quarantine or just even flooded with like just the sadness of being like, this really deeply sucks, and I'm not 100% sure what to do about it. When we get like super flooded, um, sometimes what happens is we can get either like really overwhelmed or like really disconnected from our own body. So that's where you might feel a little bit like floaty or disconnected or dissociated or something like that, which is basically your nervous system telling you this is a lot. We got to pull back a little bit, like we have to disconnect. Or you end up kind of like sitting in all those feelings and just feeling so overwhelmed that you can't do anything. So the whole point of grounding is saying instead of like staying up in like this really overwhelmed or flooded place or staying up in like our racing thoughts, we're trying to ground back to our bodies and back to like the present moment and like bring ourselves back to being kind of embodied in the present so that our stress goes down and so that we feel less flooded and then we feel more like present with ourselves. And I think that's such like an important piece in quarantine because um, different people are going to like react to quarantine a little differently. So for those of us that are like really more prone to the like anxious side of things, we might find ourselves like really flooded very easily with like all the worries and all the stress and all the like anxieties around this, or feeling really disconnected because we're like, this is just too much to handle and maybe I'm avoiding a little bit. I think for people who tend to the more like depressive side of quarantine, um, we can get flooded similarly, maybe with slightly different emotions though. It can be like the hopelessness or the helplessness or like even like um, boredom, which is something I think not a ton of people know, but boredom and anxiety are super, super close together. So if you're finding yourself being like really, really bored in quarantine, partially it's because there's nothing to do, but partially that can also be a reaction to just being like, this is super stressful. And I'm actually curious for you guys too listening, like, are you finding yourself really overwhelmingly bored? Excuse me. Um, do you find yourself veering more toward like, I'm really anxious in quarantine, or I tend to be more depressive in quarantine? So I think different people are going to react differently because mental health, manifests differently for different folks. Um, but anyway, back to grounding. Speaking of grounding in this present moment, as you can tell, I'm not the most linear thinker, so we're going to have an adventure all together today. Um, but yeah, so what grounding does is it creates a sense of peace and a feeling of being centered in our body and in the present moment. It can be really useful if you're feeling flooded or if you're feeling disconnected from yourself. And it kind of brings us back to the present moment um, and kind of like what we're doing um, in the present moment rather than all the fears or kind of the thoughts that we might be having. Hey, we have a comment from Corby who says, I was saying bored a lot in the beginning, and I think it was because I couldn't wrap my head around it all, which is so valid because, yeah, I feel like at the beginning of quarantine, it was just this really intense um, wave of like anxiety and emotion and all this sort of stuff that was coming up for everybody. And I think that feeling of boredom is really common when we're like flooded with anxiety. It can sort of come out as like, I am super just disconnected. I'm super bored. I'm like, can't latch on to the stuff that I usually want to do. So yeah, so let's talk about some like grounding techniques. Um, so the first one that I kind of want to talk about is one that, and if any of my clients are seeing or see this, they will recognize this immediately. It is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding exercise. So it's really simple. We're just going to go through your senses. And it's basically a way to say when we're feeling really flooded and really overwhelmed and we have little thoughts going, this is a way to like take a step back and like center in our body and in our surroundings. Because oftentimes, like if you've ever found yourself being like, I'm super anxious right now, and then like our brains are just kind of floating away. This is a way to kind of come back to the present in a really kind of simple way. So the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, and you can follow along if you want to. I'm really curious to hear people's reactions when they try this. So just take a deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. Just kind of like settle in. You're gonna look around, try to look and name 5 things that you can see in your surrounding, and try to do it by like also looking at colors and shapes. So I'm gonna do it in my area here. I see some blue curtains. I see a little brown vase. I see my gray sloth plushie, which is going to come in later. I see an orange box, and I see the teal wall. And remember to keep breathing deeply as we're doing this. Now you're going to tune into what your body is telling you. So now I'm going to ask you to like take some deep breaths and really tune into what you can feel. You're going to name 4 things that you can feel right now. So whether that's pressure or like pain or heat or coolness or like a texture of something that you're wearing, or the feeling of something that you're holding, or like something like that, a shape. Tune into what your body is telling you and tune into 4 things that you can feel. So that might be like, I'm feeling my kind of like shawl cardigan thing here. I feel my feet planted on the floor. I'm feeling warm because the room that I'm in is really warm. I feel my lip balm on my lips. And I'm feeling what's like the thing that's in my hair right now. I can like feel it on the top of my head. And remembering to breathe. And now we're going to try and name 3 things that you can hear. So take some time. I'm going to like be a little quiet for a second so we can all tune into what we can hear. But take a couple of breaths and just tune into like what are the sounds in your environment. Okay. And now we're getting down to the other senses. So we're going to check in with yourself and name 2 things that you can smell. And this might be a little tough depending on where you are, but if it's things like, oh, I can like smell like the laundry detergent that I used, or I smell my perfume, or I smell like food or something like this, just tune in and see if you can pick out at least 2 things that you can smell. So like I smell this little reed diffuser that I have, and I smell the perfume I have on too. And lastly, and this is the most important part of this grounding technique, is one kind thing about yourself. One kind and gentle thought. Let that sink in and breathe nice and deeply. So we went through those 5 senses, like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, pretty slowly. But this is something that you can do if you're like in the moment and feeling kind of overwhelmed. Just going through each of your senses. Saying, I'm going to pick out a few things I can see, a few things that I can feel, a few things I can smell and taste and hear, and then that again finishing it off with one kind thing about yourself. So yeah, and I'm curious as we kind of went through that if people have any reactions or like noticing anything. Um, Another couple of grounding techniques that I want to share that are in like my therapist toolbox, um, are just like different ways of breathing. So I mean, it's almost like a cliche sometimes to hear like, just breathe, if you're like really stressed out or something like this. But our breath can be such a grounding thing because it like kind of connects us to ourselves and our bodies in a really, really dramatic way. And it's something that's really easy to ignore. So if we like tune in our attention, it can be such a grounding thing to be like, okay, I feel present in this moment. I feel like I'm breathing in this moment. Um, so there are 2 kinds of breathing that I kind of want to share. One of them is called square breathing. And it's called square breathing because you can visualize it like a square. So you breathe in for a count of 4 or 5. You breathe out, or you hold your breath for a count of 4 or 5. You breathe out for the same count, and then you hold your breath again. So you alternate breathing, holding, breathing, holding. And what that does is that it takes like your nervous system, which might be kind of in hyperdrive, and basically like deactivates and slows things down so that you can kind of like feel a little bit less flooded and your nervous system feels a little bit less on fire. And the other breathing technique, and I'm going a little faster through these because they're a little bit more simple. The other breathing technique is basically like belly breathing, right? Because when you breathe really deeply, you want to expand your belly and not your chest, because that means you're getting really, really deep breaths. And this is actually a fun technique I picked up from one of my colleagues in Minneapolis, from Dr. Amy. where what she'll do is like actually lie on her stomach on the floor, like on a yoga mat or just on the floor or whatever, just something where it's like kind of a hard surface. And then we'll like belly breathe because she can feel her belly expanding because it's like moving her off the floor. So she really knows if she's getting like that deep, good belly breathing. And it's just really grounding and fun. Well, literally grounding to just like lie on the ground and just like let your belly breathing really come through. Yeah. So I'm looking at some comments here too that we're having coming in. And Talush, I think if I'm saying that right, is saying, I've tried doing this when I'm really anxious, but sometimes it's hard to remember how many of each sense to look for. Is it still an effective technique if it's roughly random number of each sense? Yes, absolutely. It's still an effective technique. It fits really neatly into the sort of like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And if you're at like a less activated place, it can be kind of fun to do it in that way. But this is totally effective even if you say, I'm literally just going to go through the different senses in my head and just pick out a few things. And to be quite honest, I even forget occasionally. Like once I get down to like 3 and 2 and 1, like I just, that it all gets kind of confused there. But yes, absolutely. If you just say, I'm going to just one at a time go through each of my senses, pick out a few things in my surroundings and really notice them, that's going to ground you super, super well. So absolutely. Great question. Yeah. Another comment here that I'm seeing from Nicole, she's agreeing with someone before her too and saying, I think I was doing the same with the change of routine. I didn't know where to begin, and saying bored was easier than saying anxious or overwhelmed. Oh, and I see she was replying to the comment before her from Madison saying, I think at the beginning I was definitely bored and a little sad about missing out on graduation. Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. Now I've come to terms with it and took some steps to be productive academically. Yeah, absolutely. I think bored can sometimes be a catch-all term both for anxiety, but also for like, we've lost a lot through quarantine. We have lost so much. And I think my heart especially breaks. I mean, my heart breaks for a lot of people, but especially for the seniors, because I work with a lot of college students and grad students and the people who graduated and not being able to really have a graduation, like that absolutely sucks. So I think, yeah, saying bored sometimes, using that word, if you're finding yourself using that a lot, that might be a great kind of like um, red flag for yourself to say, like, can I connect with myself a little bit more? Can I maybe do some grounding? Can I do some belly breathing? Can I check in with my senses? And really, I might be feeling some other emotions underneath that. Yeah. Where you're maybe a little bit too flooded or a little bit too disconnected to really understand what you're feeling. And that's why grounding is so important in like quarantine. Yeah. The other The other thing with grounding, I think that I wanted to share as well, is that it is so important. I mean, this just goes back to the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 thing as well, but it can be really awesome and important to like connect with your senses really, really deliberately. One of the things I really like is like just getting like a stone or something. Like stones are really awesome for this. But I have like a little piece of like really smooth quartz in my office that also works great for this. But if you're feeling super, super overwhelmed, you can just like grab onto a stone and just like squeeze it really hard. And what that can help you do is feel really grounded in the feeling of like that stone that you're holding. And also it's really cool because the stone itself is not going to get hurt by you squeezing it. It's not going to give, nothing bad is going to happen. If you just like hold on to it really hard, you can connect with your feelings. You can like connect with that stone itself. And nothing bad is going to happen. And usually you can also like connect to, is the stone a little bit cool? Is it like rough or is it smooth, and start to engage your senses there. So I highly recommend, both for art purposes and grounding purposes, get yourself some good rocks. So, nice. So I mentioned, Corby says, I'm bringing a stone to my workspace tomorrow. Yes, do it. Absolutely. You'd all need work stones or paint your stones. I mean, I love doing that too. Absolutely. So yeah, so like I said at the beginning, we're talking about grounding, connecting, and being nice to yourself. So we talked a lot about grounding. We talked about using your senses and using your breath and really connecting to yourself in those ways. And I think the things that that can accomplish is, first of all, it can bring down our activation if we're really anxious, really overwhelmed, really flooded, really sad. It can kind of help us go from like a 10 out of 10 to like a 7 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10, where we can deal with that a little bit better. And I think it also can help us connect with what we're really feeling. Because sometimes if we're very, very flooded and very overwhelmed, we start to get super disconnected from ourselves. And if we ground in our senses and we ground in our body, sometimes that helps us like get the information, get the data of like, oh, I was feeling really floaty and really weird. And then I did some grounding. And now I'm realizing I am really sad, or I'm really pissed off, or I'm really anxious, which is such an important piece of just taking care of yourself through quarantine. So yeah, so that is your grounding toolkit. Like, it's like a tackle box, or no, I'm confusing tackle boxes and toolkits, which tell you how much I use tools. But like, toolboxes have like compartments. So we're in the grounding compartment. Now we're moving to a new compartment. Is that a thing? Yeah. So the next compartment we're going into is connecting. And when I was thinking about this, because I was like, okay, grounding is really important for quarantine. Connecting is super important for quarantine. The first thing that came to mind was like Zoom calls and Zoom happy hours with friends. And I think everyone is really tired of hearing that. So we're all trying really hard to make it work. We're being, good, responsible people and trying to stay safe and keep each other safe through all of the social distancing. But there's only so far that like a Zoom call can really go, which I totally get. And so I think that when I think about connecting with other people or connecting in general, two things come to mind. First of all, I think we want to connect in a way that is maybe like a little bit outside the box. And this is actually where I'm super, super curious to hear all of you guys maybe chime in and like tell me what you've been doing to connect. Because yeah, Zoom happy hours are great, Zoom meetings are great. But it's sort of like we got to think outside the box of what connection even means. Because yes, that can mean talking to someone, but it can also mean saying we're going to go on a walk together and maybe be on the phone together while we're both on a walk, and we're going to talk to each other about what we see or like what we're doing or something like this. It could mean playing video games together online, but like from different locations. I have a client who would like plays a lot of online games with friends just to stay connected and stuff, and has like started a little farm, like a farm game thing with friends too, which by the way, I also have a long distance farm with a friend on Stardew Valley, the best video game ever. But like kind of finding these outside the box ways of connecting, which I think we've all sort of started to get used to as quarantine has happened. But that stuff is so important, even if it seems trivial or weird or small, even if it's like the person that you send memes to, even if it's like the person that sends you TikTok videos, which is my sister right now, every single day. And I love it. And it's like this way of saying, okay, we still have to connect with each other. We just got to think way outside the box. And I think the other thing about connection, well, actually, before I get into that, there's some comments here. Danielle says, how do I keep up with connections without feeling drained? Which is such a good question, and I will get to that in just a second. And Telush says, I've been using Netflix Party a lot, especially when we're not feeling super energized. We get to watch movies and shows together and make little comments in the chat, and it feels sweet, which is awesome. And then Corby says, I started 2 book clubs, one with my roommates and one with friends from out of state, a way to connect and also have amazing conversations. Which I feel like Danielle asked that question, and then the next 2 comments kind of answered it, which is awesome. But yeah, one of the things I think to keep an eye on when you're trying to connect with people is that feeling of like what's draining your energy versus what's like giving your energy back. And so that's what I'm saying. The creative piece and the low impact piece is super important. So doing Netflix Party, doing online games, doing something where you have like, because I think one of the things, again, here's my nonlinear thinking happening, but I think one of the things that's really hard is that when we're able to be together in person, we can just be, we can do stuff together. But when we're connecting online or from like a longer distance, it's like the only thing we can really do is process. And sometimes you just want to be with your friends. You don't want to just continue to process with your friends. Like you just want to chat rather than say like, or like not even chat. You just want to like, I don't know, go play mini golf or whatever humans do before we have quarantine. But it's really hard to do that. It's like right now you just sort of like either like look at someone's face and be like, how are you holding up? Anything new? That sort of thing. So I think, yeah, finding like low impact ways or ways to like do activities together is a really, really important place or important way to like kind of guard your energy a little bit. But that's a really, really good question. And I love the Netflix Party thing. We have another actually suggestion here. JP Rodriguez says, I've been writing letters to friends, which feels like journaling, so it's a win. Oh, that's so sweet. Writing letters is awesome. One of my sisters I write letters to because we're pen pals, so it's great. Um, yeah, that's a beautiful way to kind of connect. And again, it's like maybe doing something that feels more like an activity you can do with a friend or a lower impact way of connecting. Absolutely. The other thing I'll say with connection, this is like we're talking a lot about the how in terms of like the tools that we use to connect, which is really important, and like being creative and being low impact and finding activities rather than just processing. But the other really important piece of connection is vulnerability. And we can kind of like do all that we can to have a really good Zoom session or watch a really good movie or something like that. But if we aren't able to be vulnerable and like show up in an authentic way to our friends and our family, even when it sucks, even when we're not really feeling it, it's going to be hard to stay connected. And so I think one of the most important pieces of staying connected with people during quarantine is learning or maybe relearning how to be really vulnerable with people, which can be uncomfortable because I think some of my more vulnerable feelings during quarantine have been like, you know, I'm so bored I slept all day, or things like where you're maybe not like super proud of it, but the way to really connect with other people, and like this is true in and out of quarantine, but I think we got to get reminded of that in quarantine is to show up for each other in a vulnerable, authentic way. Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, another comment here says, my friends started a quarantine newsletter. It was so nice to get those and play the games and make the cocktails and work out a riddle. That is adorable. I deeply love that. Yeah, again, creative ways, guarding your energy and having creative ways of connecting with other people. But again, coming back to that, like vulnerability is such a big piece. The other piece of connection that I wanted to talk about and get people's input and kind of ideas around too was connecting to yourself is also super important during quarantine because I think we can get to this place where we're all like pretty tired. We can get a little numbed out. I mean, we just talked earlier with Browning about like being overwhelmed, being disconnected. Um, Connecting with other people is super important, but connecting with yourself is also incredibly important. And that's going to make other connections easier. So when I think about connecting to yourself, I think about like checking in with yourself a little bit, the same way that you might check in with a friend, being vulnerable with yourself, which sounds super weird, but I think when we're in like a period of high stress or it's like something like quarantine where everything feels really monotonous and really like oppressive, we can get to this place where we're like not really checking in and not really being honest with ourselves about how we're feeling. And so connection is just as much about connection with yourself and your own experience as it is with other people. So some ways to do that are to literally ask yourself how you're doing, literally sit with yourself. And I think some other ways of like kind of connecting to yourself um, are through, and this is going to sound a little bit hokey, but believe me, it like is really great. Is like connecting physically to stuff that like helps you feel kind of held. Because I think a lot of people are a little touch starved right now because like, again, we're doing a good thing, which is like trying to keep each other safe and trying to like socially distance and wear a mask and all of that sort of stuff. But we also can end up feeling really disconnected from ourselves if we're not able to like hug our friends and touch things like that. Which is why having stuff like weighted blankets, which are awesome, it's like a hug from an entire blanket, or like plushies or something. So I have this is my sloth plushie. Um, it's very adorable. I have not thought a name for him yet, so that can be now I'm just shamelessly using this as a way to crowdsource names for my sloth plushie. But if you have ideas, but connecting with yourself can look like something like I want a weighted blanket to like feel that touch. I can like hug a plushie. Or one of my sisters really likes these things called warmies, which are like uh, which are these like plush animals that are filled with like things like I don't know if it's like rice or beads or something, but you can put them in the microwave and warm them up. It's sort of like those like little rice bags or whatever, but it's like a plushie. And then it also smells like lavender. So something like that where you can just hug something and like feel the warmth of something is such a good way to connect to yourself. Yeah. So I'm curious for as people are kind of like hearing this, or well, other than suggesting names for my sloth friend, um, what are things that help you feel connected to yourself? So I think, yeah, a lot of the discussion around quarantine is like how do we connect with other people, But I think it's so important to connect to yourself, and that is really going to foster connection to other people. And that is such an important tool in your toolbox. It's like at least the screwdriver of your toolbox. I don't know. But yeah, I'm curious to hear if people have thoughts or if they, how they kind of um, how you connect to yourself, which is such an important piece here. Yeah. The last kind of little thing I will say about connection is uh, connecting mindfully through social media. And I say mindfully because we all know social media can be a little bit much and a little bit of a chaotic space. And there can be a lot of, comparison and a lot of, people who are saying, oh, I'm getting ripped during quarantine or whatever, or people shaming each other, body shaming, all that, which is a whole different kettle of fish. But there are ways to connect mindfully through social media. And I actually have a whole bunch of folks in the mental health spaces that are doing awesome, awesome things on Instagram, which is a great way to kind of feel connected with other people. I'll shout out a couple of them, and I think that we're going to post the rest of them. But a few of my favorites. One of them is Marley Dorsey, who used to be a coworker of mine actually, who is at Reviving Roots Therapy. She's also a Minneapolis-based therapist and just awesome social media presence. Dr. Nicole LaPera, who is the holistic psychologist. That's her Instagram handle. It's the.holistic, the psychologist, who's amazing and just shares all of these amazing. She's obviously a psychologist, but she is an amazingly like positive and uplifting and connecting kind of Instagram space. And then Jeffrey Marsh, who is at the Jeffrey Marsh on Instagram. They are an author of a book called How to Be You, and they are also like a really outspoken and visible non-binary advocate. And they have like especially for Pride Month, they've had these awesome, awesome videos where they'll just be talking about like addressing you specifically and saying like, you are valuable. I like you. I'm glad that you're here and you're valid. And it's like the most, like, it's like a hug from the internet. So if you're feeling disconnected from yourself or from other people, totally go check out Jeffrey Marsh. I think it's Marsh. They have an amazing, amazing social media presence and also are an author. Yeah. So here. So Danielle says, I like to connect with myself by spending time each day outside in my hammock. Oh, that's lovely. Yes. I mean, nature is a great way to connect with yourself. Absolutely. Nicole says, connecting with herself through turning off her phone and going out into nature, more nature stuff, walking, jogging, gardening, sitting with my thoughts. Also super amazing. I think sitting with your thoughts is so important to connect with yourself because we can be distracted a lot of the time. JP Rodriguez says, listening to music and doing more yoga. Also amazing things. I was thinking back to the webinar that Feather did about music and sound and about like connecting with yourself through that, which is awesome. Also go check that video out. Talush says, I've been trying to be really intentional about my nighttime routine. It helps me wind down even if I didn't do much throughout the day, which is also awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that kind of like intentional space that you hold for yourself is going to go so far toward like helping you connect with yourself. Absolutely. Those are some awesome, awesome ideas. Cool. So yeah, so we've been through a couple of toolbox compartments. We've talked about grounding. We've talked about connecting, which is to yourself and to others by being vulnerable, really taking time to connect to yourself, and being creative in the ways that you connect with other people. And lastly, the last thing of those three things I wanted to talk about of grounding, connecting, is being nice to yourself, which basically we're going to talk about self-care. So I did warn you guys at the beginning of this. We're going to talk about some self-care stuff. So if you have self-care ideas, now's the time to get ready with those. But yeah, I think we've heard a lot about self-care through quarantine. And I think self-care looks different in quarantine for a lot of people. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think quarantine itself and like this whole COVID crisis will show up differently for different people depending on, their trauma or their response to things or like the way that they're already leaning in terms of their mental health or their, support system. So for someone who is reacting to quarantine with a very anxious kind of energy, self-care is going to look like a lot of soothing and a lot of like bringing that intensity down. Um, but I think the thing that I think of a lot when I think about self-care is the people who, and actually I'm included in this, who deal with depression, because being in quarantine can mimic the symptoms of depression like almost exactly. So we think about being really isolated and really cut off from each other, not being able to do our hobbies, not being able to like go see other people, having really messed up sleep schedules, maybe being unemployed. Those are all things that really mimic being super depressed. So I think that self-care around that, if someone has depression or leans more to like the depressive side of their quarantine reaction, it's going to look really different. And so I think that's something to be extremely mindful of. When we think about self-care, we can sometimes think about like, well, it's like face masks and like bubble baths and like buying yourself something cute, which it totally is. But it's also about saying, all right, what do I need right now? Am I getting to this depressive place where now my body thinks I'm depressed even though I might not be, or my body thinks I'm in a depressive spiral because this is what quarantine is doing? Am I super, super activated, and do I need to pay attention to that in terms of self-care? Um, yeah. So um, I just lost my train of thought looking at comments. um, yeah, a couple of thoughts, I guess, on like a really like 30,000 foot kind of view of self-care. Um, Self-care is, it's really important to ask yourself the question with self-care activities: is this numbing or is this restorative? Because very often, first of all, like similar things can go in similar categories. um, but if we're doing something kind for ourselves, or we're doing something that's aimed at being self-care but it ends up actually numbing ourselves out, that can really, it doesn't really help, right? It either just presses pause on whatever we're going through, or it can like make us build up a little bit. So if I'm saying, oh, I'm feeling like super depressed today, like I haven't been outside or anything like that, so my self-care is going to be mindlessly scrolling, or it's going to be binge watching tons of Netflix without really paying attention to my body at all, my needs. That veers more into the numbing place, where I'm just trying to like not feel what I'm feeling, and that's not really self-care. What you want to do is veer more toward the restorative side, which can look like the same exact stuff. So I can numb myself out by playing 5 hours of video games if I'm just totally tuned out of myself. I'm not paying attention to my body, if I'm ignoring everyone around me. But I can play 5 hours of video games and have it be restorative if I'm doing it in a very mindful and intentional way. If I'm listening to myself and my body, if I'm like taking breaks and stretching and having water and like maybe playing with a friend and stuff like this. Um, so I think that the big, big question to ask yourself with self-care activities: is this numbing or is this restorative? Um, I'm curious too, for those of you listening, like, have you had self-care activities that you think, or does anything come to mind when you think, oh, is this numbing or is this restorative? Like, do you have stuff that tends to fall into the numbing category? Do you have stuff that tends to fall into the restorative category? How often do you engage with those different things? Another Instagram therapist, well, she's a real therapist who's also on Instagram. Tiffany Rowe, who's at Hey Tiffany Rowe on Instagram, says, she kind of puts it as the difference between distraction and avoidance. So where I would say numbing and restorative, she says distraction and avoidance, where distraction can be healthy, um, but avoidance or numbing is really unhealthy in a lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this is a good comment too that we're receiving. I've been trying to look at things in terms of energy. What will energize me and what will take my energy away? That's a great point, because yeah, that's again what's going to numb you out versus what's going to restore you. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the last couple things I'll say about self-care are, first of all, and I think this is really pertinent in the last, few weeks too, self-care in a way can be like almost a form of protest, because we live in a culture where we're kind of expected to work nonstop and really devalue our own selves and our own bodies. Especially Black and brown bodies are really devalued in this way of like the only thing that matters is productivity and work and money, really, and capitalism. And so in a way, being able to detach from that and step back and say like, I choose to value myself, and I choose to value my needs, and I choose to listen to myself rather than listening to, the power structures that are out there, or listening to what the patriarchy is telling me, or what white supremacy is telling me is valuable. I'm actually going to disconnect and say, I am looking at what I find valuable and what I think is valuable for me. And so, especially during quarantine, when we're getting all these messages about like, either we feel like I can't usually do the type of work that I would do to feel, um, connected to myself, or we kind of have there can be all this shame about like, oh, you're not working, or oh, you're like gaining weight, or like, there's all this like negative stuff that goes around. Being able to step back and say, no, I choose to do self-care is kind of a revolutionary thing. So keep doing some self-care, people. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of like the self-talk, um, being uh or the self-talk, the be nice to yourself piece of this is self-talk. But first, some comments. Uh, let's see here. Yeah. Ooh, so something from Nicole. I think about it as, am I doing this to help me through this emotion or experience, or to not have to go through the emotion or experience? Yes, I love that. It's a really good way to kind of make that distinction. Um, and JP Rodriguez says, well, I wouldn't call drinking self-care, but I cut back a lot during quarantine because I didn't see it adding anything energizing. Yeah. It's like um, paying attention to like what's adding energy, like another comment said earlier. Beach walking, reading more, high book clubs, yes. All really good restorative ways to self-care. Yeah. And so I guess, yes, the last thing I'll then say is about self-talk, which again, so important for quarantine, because I think right now there's a lot of like really harmful, really negative messages floating around about like, if we can't work, we're being lazy somehow. Or, if we demand, well, I mean, like in a very real way, the last few weeks, if we demand justice, we're somehow doing it wrong or something like this. Or we have a lot of negative and critical things floating around about bodies. Like, I think there's this weird expectation that either we're going to come out of quarantine with like, oh, you put on the quarantine 15 or whatever, or we're ripped like Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2, which is not, realistic for a lot of people. And also, it's such a shaming thing. Like, we're in a crisis. Like, why are we shaming each other around bodies? Um, and I think that can really seep into our self talk. So, a big, big piece of being nice to yourself in quarantine is really being gentle and kind and fair with yourself through self talk and encouraging. Um, because I think of it this way, like, how hard would it be? I mean, we're already going through quarantine, which is hard, but how much harder would it be if we had to do this while someone was following us around, criticizing everything that we did and telling us that we're like, oh, you're not going to look good at the end of this, or like, oh, you're being really lazy today, or whatever it is. Like, that would suck. And I think, unfortunately, there's some people who are going through that in reality, which is really hard. But the thing that we can control is we're not going to do that to ourselves. We can choose not to do that for ourselves and be that voice for ourselves. So trying to like be really encouraging and really gentle and really fair with yourself. And it doesn't have to be like unrealistic positive self-talk, like you're the best, no one has ever been as cool as you. Like, there are people who are cooler. I'm pretty sure, Corby's cooler than me. um, but we can be fair and we can be gentle with ourselves, and we can be really encouraging too. Yeah. Um, so yeah, and I think sometimes with self-talk there can be a little bit of difficulty with like, how do I think of self-talk? It's hard to like invent self-talk off the top of your head. So I think sometimes what we can also do is kind of think of it as like a mantra, which the concept of a mantra, which is like a word or a phrase that helps you kind of connect with your inner kindness. And like using the word mantra is a little dicey because I think it's a little appropriative of other cultures. But I think the core concept of that, of like having a word or a phrase that comes to mind that helps you connect with your positive self-talk, is really awesome. Because then you don't have to kind of do the work of like, how do I, in this moment where I'm feeling really down, like invent how to be nice to myself. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious, of those of you listening, if you had like a word or a phrase or a mantra, if you are comfortable using that word, what do you think that might be? Like, what helps you connect with this idea of being really kind to yourself, especially during quarantine, especially as all these negative kind of things are floating around? Because it is so incredibly important. Yeah. So yeah. I think I keep saying the last thing, the very last tool I will give you all, um, especially for being kind to yourself, is this acronym called RAIN. It's the Reign of Self-Compassion, which is by a woman named Tara Brach, Brach, and she is a writer and an author, and I think she leads like this mindfulness collective and like a lot of workshops and stuff like that. But she has this tool called RAIN, which stands for, the R stands for recognize. So recognize what emotions you are having without trying to change them. The A stands for accept your experience without judgment. So we're recognizing what we're feeling, we're accepting that. The I stands for investigate what might be the cause. And then the N is non-judgment. So it's this very kind of like simple breakdown of recognizing what you're feeling, trying to accept that, then going into like, I wonder what's here, and then really getting into a non-judgmental place with your own emotions. And that can be a great way to also reframe your self-talk. Then, yeah, a couple of people coming in with words or phrases for self-kindness is I am enough, which I love that one. That's so simple and so powerful. Or I can grow through what I go through, which is also lovely and just such a lovely reminder, especially as we're going through a lot right now with COVID. Yeah. Well, good. So I think that's about what I have. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maddie. I just kind of had, one more question on our end in terms of, you are a therapist. You've been seeing clients all the way through COVID, through this pandemic. Can you speak to maybe how you view mental health or the importance of mental health, maybe now or even as we look forward? Hopefully the pandemic ends at some point, but it's going on, and how maybe we can view mental health during it and after, and how if you've had any experiences during this time with your clients in terms of looking at what could be next for us.
Sure. Yeah. That's a big question, because I think I've been really, really happy and I feel really privileged to be able to continue doing this work and continue to work with clients even through quarantine and while everything is kind of happening. Because I think now more than ever, we really need to pay attention to and support each other when it comes to our mental health. Because a situation like this, a pandemic, it's basically like we're all going through a collective trauma all at once, all together, like without stopping. So I think one of the things that we know about trauma in general, and like this is our kind of collective trauma we're going through, is that if we like metabolize it, we talk about it, we experience it with other people, we take care of ourselves through it, we like go seek therapy and counseling and groups and things like this, it helps that traumatic experience not get so like stuck and crystallized in our brains. It helps our brains kind of like metabolize it. It helps us kind of like weave it into like the narrative of our life. And so I think when I think about mental health during this pandemic and during quarantine, I think of like we're going through a collective trauma, and I think the best thing that we can do is really like validate that, acknowledge that, and seek help and support where we need it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maddie. We really appreciate you doing this for us, and for those that are watching, we appreciate you all coming out. We will be spending time on Tuesday doing one more session. So we're sad to see it finally end, but we're so excited that we've gotten through June with all of these wonderful webinars from different people all over the United States, we can happily say. So next Tuesday on June 30th at 9 a.m. California time, we will be having JAMIAH. She'll be doing a low impact full body workout. And so JAMIAH will talk a little bit more about her approach to exercise and kind of just how she sees the physical aspect really connecting with the mental aspect. And for a lot of people, it's a great way to kind of reset and restore themselves, and to focus on what they need. And for those that tuned into the music one, we can also use exercise to set intention, a little like how we use music as well. Feel free to check out Sincerely Not Okay. It is the podcast that Maddie hosts for Acacia. And you can also visit us on Instagram at Acacia_CW. But I hope you all have a great evening, and we will see you next week.